Well, welcome to the webinar. My name is Michael, one of the advisors here at Raymond James. Thanks a lot for jumping in and spending a little bit of time with us. We're going to talk a little bit about 2025. We're going to look at it as a whole, and then we're going to talk through some planning opportunities as we go into this new year. Every year limits change, things change in the market. So we thought we'd unpack that together with our time together. If you have questions, feel free to send me an email, reach out to me. Love to be a resource for you. And thought we'd start with kind of where we are in the market. Obviously, the year isn't completely over yet, but we're getting pretty close in the grand scheme of things. So, how are the markets shaping up so far this year? And I like to look at three different areas to invest money: the bond market, the US stock market, and then also the international markets. And the reason I like to look at these three ways to invest, it's because that's how most investments are kind of linked. They're kind of tied to one of these three. Bonds tend to be more conservative investments, and then the stock market tends to be a little more on the risky side, both international and stocks. So far, everything you can see is green. Bond market up about 7% so far this year. US market, S&P 500, that's the 500 biggest stocks in the United States. That's up about 16%. And then international, think Honda, Toyota, Nestle, Taiwan Semiconductor. Those are all large international companies. Those have actually done really well collectively. That index or that group of investments is actually up about 29%. A lot of people don't have a lot of exposure there, but it is pretty nice to see that performance so far this year. And again, we're almost done with the year. And that I would say is kind of surprising because when you look at international, you'd think, oh, there's tariffs. There was, a handful of bad news over the past couple of years. You wouldn't think that that would have been the place to make money, but it does show that diversification really does pay off because most people have access, or I'll say exposure, to these three areas of the market. So chances are your returns were, somewhere in between the top and the bottom there. One thing that I hear a lot is, well, could we time this thing a little bit better? International hasn't done that well so far in past years, and then this year it did really well. We've seen that with the bond market, where certain years are good, and we can go all the way down to days, actually. And this is a chart that shows if you miss the best days. So this shows if you miss the best days, what your return looks like. And it's actually amazing how much your return drops. And now this is in the stock market. So the S&P 500, again, the 500 biggest stocks in the United States collectively make up this thing we look at called the S&P 500. So if you missed just the 10 best days, your return almost drops in half. Meaning if you're fully invested, and this goes back the past 20 years, you would have earned about 10%. If you miss the best 10 days, so you said, hey, things look a little skittish, or I'm not going to be in the market for a little bit, and you miss just the 10 best days out of that 20-year period. So not missing that many days in a 20-year period, your return drops all the way down to 5.6%. You look at that with missing the best 20 days, the best 30 days. And what's interesting about this is a lot of times the best days will be very near the worst days. And so when we see what's called volatility, just means markets going up and down a lot of times we have the best days and the worst days stacked together. I'm not saying next year is going to get rough or anything like that, but the market does have gyrations that go up and down. And so it is important just to keep that in the back of your mind that when we do have big negative days, sometimes those are linked to big positive days. And we want to make sure that we're not missing the positive days because you can see again the huge difference it makes over a 20-year time horizon when we look at it, again, the average return year by year. Again, it's amazing what those just in our example, the 10 days. And this is again looking at history, but we can go back even further and history looks about like this. So it's not that we picked, 20 years exactly to make this chart work. This I've seen this over my career where it always looks very similar to like to this. Sometimes the numbers are off by just a, 0.5% or something like that. But again, it's important to stay invested during the good times and the bad times to again get that long-term market return. As I alluded to in the beginning, limits change, rates change, all sorts of different things change when we go into a new year. And that's true on, I'd say, the saving side and also the, we'll say, distribution side. So some of these limits that I'm going to talk about, they might apply to you, they might not. And it's not to memorize or become an expert in all the limits for 2026. That's more, my job. But it's more to know that they exist and to kind of have a rough idea of what that looks like as we enter a new year. If you're on the saving side, so you're accumulating money, 401ks, 403bs, other company sponsored plans are a great way of doing that. The limit next year, if you're under the age of 50, is going to be 24,500. If you're over the age of 50, then you can save more. For the most part, it's about 8 grand. Unless you're 60 to 63, then you can save a little bit extra. It's called a super catch up. It's 11,000 something. So you can see the total limit there for 2026. Again, it's 24,500. And then if you're over the age of 50, you can put in an additional amount. And then again, that's through a company like a 401k or 403b. If you're saving on the outside, then those would be IRAs. Again, if it's a retirement account, individual retirement account. Looks and feels very similar to a 401k, but an IRA, as the name suggests, individual, it's not connected to a company. And there are some different rules with that, but the limits also a little bit lower for someone under the age of 50, 7,500. And then over the age of 50, it's 8,600, which is kind of a weird number, but it was indexed for inflation. And so normally we have something that's, ends in a five or a zero, but this year, just due to inflation, we have something that's 8,600 bucks. A little bit harder to remember, but again, you all don't necessarily need to memorize these numbers. Standard deduction, if this applies to you, it applies to a good amount of people, is 16,100. And then if you're married, filing jointly, it's 32,200. And then if you're over the age of 65, there's an extra deduction that you can add to the standard deduction. So this helps with Social Security taxation, just helps with taxes when you're in retirement. So if you're taking the standard deduction and you're over 65, there is a little bit higher standard deduction for you. Again, just something to keep in the back of your mind. A couple other things to keep also on your mind calendar would be if you're under the age of 65 and you're on health insurance and you have a subsidy. Lots of ifs in there, but chances are if you're in the marketplace through a marketplace plan or not part of a group health plan, you probably know this already, but you need to control your income because if you take too much out of an IRA, make too much at a job, then you do not get that subsidy. So just something to be mindful of that. And then the gift limit for next year is 19,000. Gift limit is just what you can give another person without any tax consequences, without filling out any forms. If you go above that, doesn't mean it's taxable, just means you have to fill out a tax form. Doesn't apply to everybody, but if you're funding maybe a college account for a grandchild, that could come into play. Maybe you're gifting money for a child to buy their first house. Again, just keep that in mind, and that is per person. So husband and wife can do, 38 grand if it is for their son or daughter or something like that. Again, some of these limits might not apply to you, some of them might, but again, it's just to keep them in the back of your mind and kind of have a rough idea of what they are as we look towards 2026. With our time together, I also wanted to look at taxes because I know this can be somewhat of a confusing abstract concept for a lot of people, but specifically looking at income in retirement and designing that income stream in the most tax efficient way possible. What I mean by that is we want to have buckets of money that produce taxes differently. I think we've all heard don't have all your eggs in one basket from a diversification investment perspective. I think we've been, our industry has certainly beat that into people's head. Hey, don't put all your money in XYZ stock. So I think we understand that from an investing perspective, but I think oftentimes we miss it from a tax perspective, meaning we put all of the money in the 401k or we put all of our money in a certain type of account. But when we go to retire, it's really nice to have some pre-tax money, some Roth money, some after-tax money, because again, it's taxed differently and that income is counted differently when we look at Social Security taxation and Medicare premiums. Your Medicare premiums can actually be tied to income as well. The more money you make, the higher your Medicare, your health insurance can be in retirement. A lot of people don't know that. So it's just, let's be mindful of the different types of accounts that we have and the tax consequences, whether they count for owing taxes, whether they count for Social Security taxation, whether they count in our Medicare health insurance equation. Again, here's a chart that shows what's counted for taxes, what's counted for Social Security and Medicare. And again, if you want to talk through this, you want more information about it, I'm happy to have that conversation with you. Another thing to be mindful of, not this year and I would say years going forward. And this is a pretty specific thing. And if you're a client of ours, we've already dealt with this. So it's not something that this is going to be new information where you're like, oh, wait, what? If you inherited an account from maybe mom or dad and they were taking distributions from it, those accounts have to have a distribution. It's called a required minimum distribution. There was some flexibility that went away this year. So just be mindful of that. Again, if you inherited an IRA, individual retirement account, or a 401k, or maybe something, from a state retirement system, something like that, up to this point, you didn't have to take any money out. But if that person that passed away was taking distributions, chances are you have to take distributions as well. So just be mindful of that. We don't want you to miss that because there are some tax penalties if you don't take out what you're required to. It occurs for you personally at age 73, but it also occurs when you inherit an account from somebody that's over the age of 73. And again, there were some rule changes for 2025 that we're going to carry on really for the next 10 years or so. As follow-up, we do have a year-end planning checklist, and it just lists some things to think about. We'll send this out in an email along with the video recap. Again, if anything sparks your interest or you want to chat through it, feel free to let me know. We do have an upcoming webinar. That's how we're going to start the year. It's Thursday, January 29th. It's also on Zoom at noon. It's going to be the year-end review for 2025. I'll have a lot more market data at that point. Obviously, we'll have the entire year, nice 2025, all complete. We'll know the exact market returns for all those industries. I'll also have a good amount of economic research at that point from the previous year and looking towards 2026. And then we'll talk about some planning tips going into the new year. We'll be about a month into 2026 at that point, but hope you'll join us for that. If you have any questions, or perhaps there's a topic you'd like to see at another webinar, feel free to let me know. I'd love to include that. And again, if you have any questions, we're here as a resource. Thanks for spending some time with us.